Brooks gripped the edge of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes scanning the room for the most influential guests. I watched him from the head table, my expression unreadable, noting how the expensive silk of his suit couldn't hide his lack of character. Adelaide sat beside me, her posture as sharp and elegant as a diamond, showing no sign of the betrayal we both felt simmering in the air. The ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed expectations of the city's elite, all gathered to celebrate our 25 years of marriage. Brooks cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the speakers until it felt like a physical weight against my chest. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. My son leaned into the microphone, a twisted smile playing on his lips that he clearly thought looked triumphant. "We're all here for a lie," he began, his voice cutting through the polite silence like a rusted blade. I didn't reach for my water or look down at the tablecloth. I kept my gaze locked on his, forcing him to look at the man he was trying to ruin. He claimed our union was nothing more than a strategic merger, a cold-blooded arrangement to secure the family fortune. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and told the room that love had never once entered our home. I felt the collective gasp of the guests, a wave of pity and shock that rolled toward us. But I remained as steady as an oak. Adelaide's hand remained perfectly still on the table, her wedding ring catching the light with a cold, mocking brilliance. We weren't the ones who were about to lose everything in this room, though Brooks was too blinded by his own greed to realize it. He paused for dramatic effect, leaning in closer to deliver the final insult, unaware that a shadow was already moving toward the stage from the back of the hall. The air in the room suddenly turned ice cold, as if the very walls knew the truth was about to be unleashed. I watched the waiter nearby freeze mid-pour, a stream of expensive Chardonnay splashing onto the cuff of a senator's sleeve. It's funny how a few ugly words can paralyze a room faster than a fire alarm. I've survived 3 corporate takeovers and a week lost in the Rockies with nothing but a pocket knife. Yet this tuxedo felt like it was shrinking by the second. I remember teaching Brooks how to ride a bike. I clearly should have taught him that speed is useless if you're heading straight toward a cliff. Beside me, Adelaide picked up a single grape, inspecting it with the scrutiny of a diamond merchant before placing it back down. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy you could almost hear the interest rates rising on our family's reputation. I looked at our guests, men I've known for decades, who were now looking at their plates as if the salmon held the secrets of the universe. Brooks took a sip of his wine, his pinky finger extended in that pretentious way he'd picked up at prep school. It was the same finger he used to point at the door when he tried to fire our gardener for looking at him wrong last summer. I've always said that if you want to see a man's true face, give him a little bit of power and a captive audience. He wasn't just attacking our marriage. He was auditioning for a role as a villain in his own life story. I felt a strange urge to tell him his fly was slightly unzipped, a small habit of his when he gets agitated, but I decided the public's gaze was already sharp enough. The anxiety in the air was palpable, vibrating through the floorboards like a low-frequency hum. My son was enjoying the spotlight, far too much to notice the storm clouds gathering at the back of the room. Brooks leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a reckless intent that suggested he hadn't even reached the most poisonous part of his script. I felt the slight vibration of my phone in my pocket, a text from the one person in this room who knew the exact price of every lie Brooks was telling. Brooks pointed a trembling finger at Adelaide, claiming she had signed a secret financial ledger the very day before our wedding to ensure her payout. The audacity was almost impressive. I haven't seen that much fiction in one room since I accidentally walked into a high school drama rehearsal by mistake. I watched Sloane, his wife, nod along in the front row, her face frozen in a mask of calculated grief that probably cost more than my first car. It is a peculiar feeling, watching the child you raise to value integrity use his tongue as a scalpel on the woman who gave him life. I remember when Brooks was 6 and cried for 3 hours because I wouldn't let him eat a blue crayon. Now he was throwing a tantrum with a wireless microphone and an expensive wine list. He told the room that our agreement was the only reason our family business had survived the market crash years ago. My hands remained steady on the table, though my mind was busy cataloging every favor I'd ever done for the people currently whispering behind their silk napkins. People treat a scandal like a free buffet. They can't wait to fill their plates even if they know the meat is poisoned. I glanced at the head waiter by the kitchen door, wondering if he realized his perfectly seared scallops were now the second most interesting thing in the ballroom. I've lived through recessions, lawsuits, and a 3-day fishing trip with a brother-in-law who never stops talking about his allergies, so I can certainly handle a little public character assassination. But there is a specific kind of cold that settles in your marrow when your own flesh and blood tries to trade your honor for a moment of perceived power. I didn't interrupt him because when a man is busy digging his own grave, it is considered impolite to take away his shovel. I felt Adelaide's grip tighten just a fraction on her silver fork, not from fear, but with the deadly focus of a predator waiting for the perfect opening. Brooks leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as he prepared to reveal the proof he had been hiding in his breast pocket. The room held its collective breath, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of my son's credibility. Brooks pulled a faded yellow envelope from his jacket, and I realized he had actually broken into my private study to steal what he thought was a smoking gun. He didn't understand that some papers are kept locked away not to hide a crime, but to protect the very person holding them. Brooks brandished that yellow envelope like a winning lottery ticket, completely unaware he was holding the receipt for his own social bankruptcy. I slowly reached into my tuxedo pocket for my reading glasses, the ones I usually reserve for fine print and menus that use too much French to describe a simple piece of chicken. It's a bit rich being insulted at a gala I'm personally funding. I should have at least negotiated a public humiliation discount with the catering manager. Brooks shouted into the microphone that this document proved Adelaide had been receiving an annual loyalty bonus just to keep the ring on her finger. I watched the guests lean in, their faces a mixture of predatory curiosity and the kind of pity that feels like a slap. I've seen men lose their fortunes on a single roll of the dice, but my son was losing his soul for a moment of applause from people who wouldn't remember his name by Tuesday. I thought back to the chess matches we played when he was 10, and how I repeatedly warned him never to expose his king for a mere pawn. He was too busy playing the tragic hero of his own melodrama to notice the waitstaff exchanging frantic, knowing glances near the kitchen. Garrison, the billionaire owner of this establishment and a man who has shared more than a few silent sunsets with me, was suddenly standing by the service entrance. He wasn't just the man whose name was on the building. He was a witness to the parts of my life that Brooks had never bothered to ask about. My son started reading a paragraph aloud, his voice cracking with a sudden, misplaced excitement that made him look desperate rather than powerful. I took a slow sip of my water, the ice clinking against the glass with a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. You can buy a tailored suit and a membership to the right clubs, but you cannot buy the kind of silence that precedes a total landslide. Garrison stepped out of the shadows and began walking toward the stage with a stride that made the floorboards seem to groan in anticipation. He didn't look like a man coming to save a friend. He looked like a man coming to settle a debt that Brooks didn't even know he owed. Brooks was so intoxicated by the sound of his own voice that he didn't notice Garrison approaching from his blind side. He was reading from the stolen document with the misplaced confidence of a man who thinks he's found a shortcut to the top, unaware he was actually reading his own professional obituary. I glanced down and realized I'd used the seafood fork for my salad earlier, a minor tactical error compared to the total social suicide my son was currently committing. At my age, you learn that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to say, and Brooks was practically screaming. He was painting a picture of a cold, transactional marriage, calling Adelaide a hired companion in front of the very women she had mentored in business for 3 decades. I noticed a tiny speck of mustard on my lapel, probably from an hors d'oeuvre I shouldn't have reached for, and for a second, it bothered me more than my son's scripted venom. My tie felt slightly crooked, and I had half a mind to interrupt Brooks just to ask him to straighten it, simply to see if his childhood reflexes would kick in. The room was so still I could hear the hum of the industrial refrigerators vibrating through the soles of my shoes. Brooks's voice rose to a fever pitch, claiming I had bribed Garrison years ago to falsify our family's history to cover up a sham union. Garrison reached the edge of the stage, his presence casting a long, cold shadow that seemed to swallow my son's spotlight. Brooks looked at him, confused, likely expecting a nod of agreement from the man he desperately wished to impress. But Garrison has never been anyone's peer. He is a predator who remembers every drop of blood he's ever seen in the water. I leaned back, crossing my legs with a deliberate slowness that signaled I was finally ready to be entertained. It's a pity, really, that Brooks never learned that some people own the stage simply because they built the entire theater. Garrison reached out and plucked the microphone from Brooks's trembling hand with the effortless grace of a man taking a dangerous toy from a toddler. The silence that followed was more deafening than any of the accusations, a void waiting to be filled with a truth that would leave Brooks with nowhere to hide. Brooks stood there like a goldfish that had finally realized the glass bowl was a prison, his mouth working but no sound coming out. I checked my left cufflink, which had become annoyingly loose. If it fell off now, it would be the only thing in this room with less structural integrity than my son's accusations. There is a specific kind of weight that settles in your chest when you realize your own legacy has been twisted into a weapon against the woman you love. I once spent 3 days rebuilding a vintage engine just to prove to Brooks that things of value require sweat and patience. Yet here he was, trying to burn down a 30-year forest for a handful of ash. The irony of him calling our life a sham while Sloane stood beside him, likely calculating the resale value of our furniture, was a bit too on the nose even for a soap opera. I've survived boardroom mutinies and shark-infested waters, but watching my own blood play the part of a Judas for a crowd of strangers was a new kind of fatigue. Garrison didn't speak immediately. He just stared at the stolen envelope in his hand as if it were a piece of rotten fruit. The silence in the ballroom was so thick it felt like we were underwater, everyone's lungs burning for a breath of truth that Brooks was incapable of providing. I looked at Adelaide, her eyes fixed on the stage with a terrifyingly calm focus that told me she was no longer seeing her son, but a threat to be managed. My son's face was turning a desperate shade of magenta, the sweat finally breaking through his expensive foundation as the reality of Garrison's presence settled in. I've always said that a man who doesn't respect his roots will eventually find himself falling over in the slightest breeze, and the wind was just starting to pick up. Brooks reached out for the microphone again, a frantic, reflexive move, but Garrison simply stepped back, keeping the device out of reach like a parent with a dangerous toy. The room grew colder, the crystal chandeliers overhead rattling ever so slightly as the billionaire prepared to reveal exactly what was inside that yellow envelope. Garrison finally looked up from the papers, and the expression on his face made the entire room recoil in a collective, silent shudder. He wasn't just going to correct the story. He was about to reveal a secret about Brooks that would make his accusations look like a bedtime story. Garrison didn't look at the crowd. He looked at me, a silent conversation passing between us that bridged 30 years of brotherhood and shared secrets. I thought about the time Brooks tried to invest his college fund in a company that made solar-powered umbrellas. I should have seen his lack of basic logic even back then. I adjusted my watch, noticing it was exactly 9:14 p.m., the precise moment my son's life as he knew it began to dissolve into irrelevance. It is a peculiar feeling to realize that you can provide everything for a child except a moral compass and a sense of timing. Adelaide's hand was a statue on the table, her composure so absolute it made the air around her feel pressurized and dangerously cold. I nearly let out a dry chuckle thinking about the argument we had over the centerpieces. I wanted orchids, she wanted lilies, and now the room smelled like a funeral for a reputation. Garrison finally cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding together, and the whispers in the back of the room died instantly. "Brooks," Garrison said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall, "you have a remarkable talent for reading only the pages that suit your vanity." He held up the yellow envelope, pulling out a second sheet of paper that Brooks had conveniently left tucked inside the lining. I watched my son's eyes widen as he recognized the document. It wasn't a payoff agreement for Adelaide, but a trust fund for Brooks that he had already emptied through forged signatures. The irony was as sharp as the crease in my trousers. The boy was accusing us of greed while standing on a platform built from his own thefts. I felt a surge of cold, concentrated rage, the kind that doesn't make you scream, but makes your every movement very, very precise. I didn't need to say a word. I just watched as the guest began to recoil from Brooks as if he were suddenly contagious. My son looked at me, his face pale and eyes pleading for a lifeline I had no intention of throwing to a sinking ship. This wasn't just a revelation. It was the final, heavy lid on a coffin Brooks had spent the entire evening building for himself. Garrison leaned back into the mic, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to deliver the blow that would not just embarrass Brooks, but leave him completely destitute in the eyes of the law. The billionaire turned to the audience and smiled, an expression that held no warmth, only the promise of a cold, hard justice.
I've spent 25 years maintaining a certain level of poise, but watching my son wither under Garrison's gaze felt more satisfying than any vintage Cabernet. I noticed the way Sloane was slowly backing away from Brooks, as if stupidity were an airborne virus she could catch through her Chanel perfume. It's amusing how quickly the loyal wife calculates an exit strategy when the bank account starts to bleed. My shoes were slightly pinching my left toe, a small price to pay for the sheer theater of watching a man dismantle his own future in real time. I thought about the many times I'd smoothed over Brooks's misunderstandings in his youth. I suppose I should have let him spend a night in a cell to learn that bars don't care about your last name. I didn't feel the need to cry, because tears are for the helpless, and I have never been more in command of my life than in this silent ballroom. The guests were staring at me now, searching for a crack in my mask, but all they found was the cold, polished surface of a woman who had outlived her patience. I wondered for a fleeting second if I'd left the porch light on back at the estate, a small domestic concern in the middle of a social earthquake. Brooks looked at me, his eyes wide and watery, probably hoping for that maternal instinct that usually overrides logic. But he forgot that a mother's love is a shield, and once you try to break the person holding it, the shield becomes a wall. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, the bubbles sharp and biting against my tongue, much like the words I was preparing to speak. I caught Garrison's eye and gave him a microscopic nod, the signal that he had my full permission to finish what our son had started. The air around the head table felt like frozen glass, fragile and sharp, waiting for the slightest vibration to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Garrison adjusted his glasses, his hands moving with a terrifying precision as he pulled a third, much smaller document from the envelope. He didn't look at Brooks. He looked directly into the camera of the videographer recording the event, ensuring every word would be immortalized. Garrison cleared his throat, and the sound echoed like a gavel in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Brooks stood frozen, his face the color of the pale linen napkins he'd insisted we use to modernize the look of our anniversary. I noticed a stray hair on Garrison's lapel and felt a sudden, ridiculous urge to fix it. Habit is a strange thing when your world is undergoing a controlled demolition. I've spent 3 decades curating our family's reputation, and it took Brooks exactly 15 minutes to treat it like a clearance bin at a closing department store. He looked toward Cyrus, our attorney who was sitting 2 tables away, but Cyrus was suddenly very interested in the texture of his bread roll. It's fascinating how quickly friends become spectators when the lion finally decides to stop purring. This third document, Garrison began, his voice like silk over steel, is a mortgage application Brooks filed using his parents' primary estate as collateral. The gasp from the room was collective and sharp, a cold wind that finally seemed to blow the smugness right off my son's face. He had attempted to pawn the very roof over our heads to fund a venture that had already collapsed 6 months ago. I leaned back, my hand resting on the table with the stillness of a predator that knows the prey has no exits left. I thought about the time I taught him to play poker and he cried because I didn't let him win with a pair of 2s. He clearly hadn't learned that in the real world, you don't get a trophy for trying to rob your own parents. Garrison paused, letting the weight of the fraud settle over the room, letting everyone see the heroic whistleblower for the thief he truly was. I could see the sweat staining his collar, a physical manifestation of his panic that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. My husband's hand was still over mine, a warm, solid constant in a room full of shifting loyalties. Brooks lunged toward the stage, his dignity finally giving way to a raw, ugly desperation that made several guests stand up in alarm. He was no longer trying to prove a point. He was trying to destroy the evidence before Garrison could say another word. Brooks didn't even make it to the stairs before 2 of Garrison's security staff materialized like shadows, intercepting him with a silent, professional efficiency. It was an embarrassing display of athleticism. I remembered when he was 12 and tripped over his own shadow during a school play, and it seems some things never change. I leaned toward my husband and whispered that we should have invested in a gym membership for him instead of those private philosophy tutors who clearly taught him nothing about the consequences of reality. My husband didn't laugh, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch in that dry, cynical way that usually preceded a total boardroom execution. The ballroom was now a theater of the absurd, with the elite of society watching my son struggle like a frantic moth against a windowpane. Garrison didn't even blink. He simply held the microphone higher, his gaze fixed on the panicked eyes of the boy who had tried to play a man's game with a child's deck of cards. "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, Brooks," Garrison said, his voice echoing through the speakers with a chilling, clinical calmness. I looked at the table of our distant relatives, who were now pretending to be fascinated by the floral arrangements as if they hadn't been nodding along to the lies 5 minutes ago. It's a strange thing, watching the child you once rocked to sleep turn into a stranger who views your life as a transaction to be liquidated. I felt a brief flash of regret, not for the situation, but for the fact that I'd chosen such a heavy dress for a night that required so much mental agility and so little actual celebration. Brooks was forced back into his seat, his breathing ragged and his composure completely shattered, looking like a man who had finally realized the floor was no longer beneath him. He looked at me, his eyes wide and searching for a mercy I had already packed away with his childhood toys and forgotten trophies. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see the exact moment the bank of maternal forgiveness closed its doors for good. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on his lies as Garrison opened the last folder in that yellow envelope. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the blood that Brooks had tried to turn into ink for a contract he could never fulfill. Garrison pulled out a small digital recording device, and the sound of Brooks's own voice began to fill the room, discussing a plan that went far beyond mere financial fraud. The first few words made the air in the room vanish, as my son's voice calmly detailed how he intended to declare us mentally unfit to take full control of the estate. The audio of Brooks's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, every syllable of his plan to have us committed sounding like a dull blade against a stone. I looked at my husband, who was calmly adjusting his tie, seemingly more concerned with a loose thread than the fact that his son had tried to steal his sanity. I can't even remember where I put the spare keys to the Buick half the time. He leaned over and whispered to me with a ghost of a smirk, but I'm fairly certain I'm not senile enough to hand the deed to the house to a man who wears loafers without socks. His dry wit was the only thing keeping the air from freezing solid as our son's recorded voice detailed the exact clinic he'd picked out for us. Sloane was now looking at her husband as if he were a burning building she was no longer insured for, her hand inching toward her purse. I wondered if she was checking for her lipstick or her prenuptial agreement. With her, the two are usually kept in the same pocket. Brooks tried to stand again, but his legs seemed to have the structural integrity of overcooked pasta, and he slumped back into his chair with a pathetic thud. "It's a deepfake. An AI fabrication," he shrieked, his voice hitting a register that only dogs and disappointed mothers could truly appreciate. Garrison didn't even look up from the recording device, his thumb hovering over the stop button with a practiced, predatory patience. The guests were no longer whispering. They were staring at Brooks with the kind of clinical detachment one usually reserves for a laboratory specimen. I felt a strange sense of clarity, realizing that the child I had protected from every scraped knee and bruised ego had grown into a man who feared our strength more than he loved our lives. My husband tapped his finger on the mahogany table, a rhythmic, steady beat that sounded like a countdown to a final judgment. We had survived a quarter-century of life's real trials, only to be tested by the vanity of a boy who thought he could outrun his own shadow. I stood up slowly, not because I was shaken, but because the room needed a focal point for the storm that was about to break. My husband followed my lead, his movement so synchronized with mine that the guests actually stepped back, sensing the shift in power. The recording ended with a click, leaving a silence so absolute that the sound of Brooks's heavy breathing was the only thing left in the air. Garrison reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, red ledger that I recognized immediately, the one piece of evidence Brooks had forgotten he'd ever signed. The look on my son's face suggested he finally understood that some debts are paid in something far more valuable than cash. Garrison held the red ledger aloft, and for the first time tonight, Brooks looked truly small, like a child caught with his hand in a jar of broken glass. My husband leaned toward me, his breath smelling of the peppermint he always takes to settle his stomach before big events, and whispered, "I spent 40 minutes looking for the TV remote this morning only to find it in the freezer, but somehow, I never lost track of this little book." I couldn't help but smile. Even in the middle of a family assassination, he still found a way to remind me of our shared, messy humanity. The guests watched us as if we were a pair of statues that had suddenly started to breathe, their faces etched with a morbid fascination. Brooks tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled rasp, a ghost of the arrogance he'd wielded so clumsily just moments ago. The red ledger was the record of his independent investments, a trail of back-alley deals and sold-out family secrets that smelled of desperation and bad meth. It wasn't just a list of numbers, it was a map of every time he'd chosen a shortcut over the long, hard road of integrity we had paved for him. I saw several of our business rivals in the back of the room suddenly look very interested in the exit signs, realizing their names were likely written on those pages. It is a rare thing to see the exact moment a man realizes he has traded a kingdom for a handful of sand that is now slipping through his fingers. My husband stood perfectly still, his hands folded behind his back, looking more like a judge than a victim. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity, not for the man our son had become, but for the boy he once was, the one who used to believe we were invincible. But pity is a luxury we can no longer afford when the house is on fire and the arsonist is holding the matches. Garrison flipped to the final page, his expression darkening as he reached the section detailing the planned liquidation of our family's charity foundation. The room seemed to contract, the air thickening with the weight of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical blow to everyone who had ever trusted our name. Garrison looked at Brooks, then at the head of the security team, his silence more terrifying than any verbal threat. The true cost of the ledger was about to be revealed, and it wasn't a price that could be paid in dollars. Garrison closed the red ledger with a finality that sounded like a tomb door shutting on a long-held secret. He looked at Brooks and calmly announced that every piece of evidence, the recordings, the forgeries, and the ledger, had been forwarded to the district attorney's office an hour ago. My husband leaned in and whispered that if he'd known the night would be this productive, he wouldn't have spent 20 minutes arguing with the GPS to find a restaurant he's visited for 30 years. I suppose taking the long way was a blessing. It gave Garrison just enough time to verify the final offshore account. Brooks looked toward the exit, but the security guards were no longer just standing there. They were waiting for the signal to transition him from a gala to a precinct. Sloane had already vanished, presumably to see if she could still return her jewelry before the accounts were officially flagged for fraud. I found myself wondering if the catering bill included a surcharge for public ruin, or if my son's lack of foresight was simply a complimentary gift to the guests. It is a strange, quiet relief when the person you raised finally reveals they were never listening to a word you said about honor. My husband pulled a small, silver pen from his pocket, clicking it with a steady, rhythmic sound that echoed through the frozen ballroom. The guests began to shrink away from the head table, terrified that their own associations with Brooks might be documented in that red book. I watched my son sink to his knees, his expensive suit finally looking like the ill-fitting costume of a boy who tried to play a man's game. We had stood our ground because we refused to let a coward inherit the legacy we built with our own sweat and blood. Garrison stepped back, giving us the floor for the final word, his eyes reflecting a grim, brotherhood-bound satisfaction. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean, like the air after a thunderstorm has finally cleared the smog. My husband reached out and took the microphone, his movement slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He looked down at Brooks, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as he prepared to speak. The final truth was about to be unleashed, and it would be the one thing my son could never survive. My husband didn't say a word. He simply stood there with the quiet authority of a man who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. Garrison stepped back to the microphone, informing the stunned audience that the sham marriage contract Brooks had read was actually a trust document that transferred every cent of our fortune to a local orphanage, effective immediately upon our passing. My husband whispered to me that he hoped the orphans liked the antique grandfather clock, mostly because he'd never been able to figure out how to stop the chime from waking him up at 3 a.m. Brooks looked like he'd been struck by lightning, realizing his entire exposure was just a public announcement that he had successfully disinherited himself. I watched as the police led him away for the forgeries Garrison had detailed, his expensive shoes squeaking on the marble floor like a trapped mouse. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to tell the lead officer to make sure Brooks wore a coat, but then I remembered he'd tried to put us in a cage, and I let the thought go. My husband leaned over and admitted that his socks were actually mismatched under his trousers, one navy, one black, and that was the only lie he was willing to admit to tonight. We stood in the center of that ballroom as the friends who had doubted us shuffled out in a shamefaced, frantic silence. Love isn't a ledger or a contract. It is the marrow in your bones that keeps you upright when the world tries to knock you down. Garrison walked over and gave us a sharp nod, a silent acknowledgement between titans who had survived the petty greed of the next generation. I realized then that 25 years wasn't just a number, but a fortress we had built stone by stone, too thick for any traitor to breach. I adjusted my husband's lapel one last time, brushing off the imaginary dust of a son who had chosen to be a stranger. We walked out of that ballroom with our heads held high, leaving the echoes of the scandal to die out in the empty hall. We were not broken, we were not tired, and we were certainly not finished. As we reached the car, my husband winked and told me he'd finally remembered where the spare keys were. They were in his pocket the entire time. We drove home into the quiet night, knowing that our story was far from over and that we had finally won the peace we deserved.